And you are live.
Hey there. Long time no see. Welcome to Hey, Ask Me Stuff, the show where you out there in the audience get to, hey, ask me stuff. I am Ken Coughlin, and back there on the other side of the glass, we have...
B.A. Thomas. How's it going?
Hello, B.A. Thomas. Hey, welcome very much. Thank you very much for joining us here today. We have not been on the air for...
2 weeks?
2 weeks. The last 2 weeks we had not been on. And it was this show that was supposed to be on, and we kept having to postpone it.
Yeah.
And I did, anybody watching the show right now is probably already getting a little bit of a hint about why we had to postpone it. But I did promise people I would update everyone on what's been going on for the past 2 weeks and why, unfortunately, this show kept having to get pushed back. So for those of you that are watching us, whether live or after the fact, thank you very much for sticking with us. The short version, as short as possible, of the story, so you know what happened, is about 2 weeks ago today, I woke up in the morning and found that when I was trying to brush my teeth, I wasn't able to hold the right side of my mouth closed, and so went immediately to the emergency room, worried that I might have been having a stroke. Good news, it was not a stroke. It was something called Bell's palsy. It actually started with something in my right ear. To this day, actually, nobody can quite identify what exactly was for sure going on in my right ear. But if you don't know what Bell's palsy is, it's essentially there's a nerve that goes, kind of right near where your ear is, actually, and controls all the muscles on each side of your face. Well, that nerve can get swollen. And when it does, you actually lose the ability to control the muscles on that side of your face that's controlled by the nerve. And that's what happened to me. It's kind of funny because you lose the function, the ability to use those muscles, but you don't lose sensation. So all the nerves that control touch and feel still work. You just can't move anything, but you can still feel everything. So it is, the overwhelming majority of the time, it's something that is easily recoverable, sometimes in a few weeks, sometimes in a few months. Those of you that have been following my journey here, I want to thank you for all the prayers and support. Last week, what happened, we were going to do the show last week, but I actually, 15 minutes before we were supposed to go on the air.
If even that.
Yeah, I got a call from my ear, nose, and throat doctor, and because if it had been an actual ear infection that started it, and it turns out it wasn't apparently, but if it had actually been an ear infection combined with Bell's palsy, that possibly could have been indicative of something more serious. And so when my ENT found out about this, she said, hey, no, I need you to stop what you're doing and come in right now. So it's like 15 minutes before the show, we had to cancel the show again. Yeah. And I had to stop what I was doing and go right into the ENT. But again, it turned out that was not the problem. So it is just Bell's palsy. So if I look a little weird, if I sound a little weird, that's why. Actually, I have made a lot of progress over the past 2 weeks. Yes. Originally, I couldn't even close my right eye. I can do that. I'm starting to be able to get some of the motion in my cheek muscles and everything back. I can start to do a little bit of a smile, not much of one. And so I've still got a journey ahead of me for the full recovery, but that's what's been going on. So there you go. But I can still talk. I can still get my opinions. And so that's what I'm going to do.
Sounds good to me.
Speaking of opinions, Mr. Thomas back there, our topic for the week today, actually, before you need to keep me in line because there's something I'm supposed to do before I start talking about the topic.
You're supposed to mention about, you're supposed to talk about ringing bells and not a number of times.
About what?
Ringing bells.
Oh, ringing bells and not a number of times, yes.
Giving people thumbs ups.
And that is, if you please, if you like our video here, go ahead and click the like button on this video. An odd number, as many times as you want, as long as it's an odd number, so it stays in the like position. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We got a lot of great content coming up, including premiering by the end of this month a new show called The 513 Show, which is for all of you worship leaders or musicians out there. You're going to like this one. This show is for you. It's basically a program where Robert Koger here from our media team is going to be interviewing different people that are involved in worship music about certain instruments that they use, for example, and why they use them, why they chose them, what they do with them, how they help exemplify or amplify the worship experience. That's going to be premiering before the end of this month. I do have a tentative date for that, but I haven't even told Robert yet, so I won't disclose that here on the air. Okay. But that is coming up. So go ahead and click subscribe and click that notification bell so that you don't miss out any of the wonderful new content we've got coming up here on the channel. If you are watching us live, you can comment in the live chat either on Facebook or YouTube and be part of the conversation. And we can actually interact here live on the air. If you do comment on YouTube, then we actually have the ability, and by we, I mean BA, has the ability to actually put your comment on the screen so we can actually see it while we're talking about it as well. So if you're watching us live, please go ahead, join the conversation. If you're not watching it live and you're watching it after the fact, well, still join the conversation by putting your comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts about what we are talking about today. And speaking of what we're talking about today, BA, no, wait, did I forget something? What did I forget? Oh, I forgot the comment, how to get your comment on. I did, you're right. I'm a little rusty, okay? It's been 3 weeks. Okay. So, yes, because this show is, let me say, it's Hey, Ask Me Stuff, where what we talk about every week is determined by you, the viewer. We want to be talking about what you want to talk about, what the questions you have, concerns you have, things you maybe wondered about and want a little more information about. And there's a lot of different ways you can get your topic here on the air, to be considered to be on the air. Chief among them is by going to our website, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff, where there is a form. I think I'm saying this, and as I'm saying this, BA, Sarah's not here today.
She's not.
We need to confirm with Sarah that page is still up because we just put up a new website.
We did. Trinity Joppa did put up a whole new website. Good job, Sarah, on it. Looks really great. I'm guessing, and this is a 50-50 guess, the most dangerous kind. 50-50 guessing that because it is a whole separate page, and she copied the original website and translated it into Wix or whoever does it for us now,
right? That
it's still there. It might look a little different, but it should still work. You should be able to go to trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff, put in your question, and then we'll read it live on air.
If it's not there, Sarah comes back to work tomorrow.
She does.
So we'll have it on there as quickly as possible. But yeah, you can submit any question there, anything you want under the sun that has to do with Christ, Jesus, Christianity, the Bible, and then we can look at that and take that into consideration for a future show. Also, kind of usually by Mondays, we try to have a general idea of what we're going to be talking about, maybe not as specific, boiled down specifically. And so we will also post a general question on our subreddit, which is Talk About God. Subreddit's called Talk About God. Yep. So if you're on Reddit, you can go to that subreddit and look for whatever that question or prompt is on Mondays, and you can comment there as well. And that's another way of possibly getting your topic, your thoughts on the air. So you're invited to do that. Now, we're finally ready to go into today's topic, right?
Yes, we're ready.
And you were actually the seed of this topic, BA, so I'm going to let you introduce what our topic is.
So today's topic is, are the 10 Commandments binding today? And let me preface it. I don't mean, okay, we can go murder people now. Jesus said just love each other. I would love to murder somebody. Not what I mean.
Because some people on Reddit thought that's what you meant.
Oh, yeah, I know. But I wasn't there to set them straight, so that's fair. Because Jesus sacrificed himself to bring us closer to God, to get us into heaven if we believe, as per creeds, do the 10 Commandments mean exactly what they did, I guess, BC as they do AD? That's really what my question is has the meaning changed, and if so, how has it changed? So I'll pass it back to you. I
think that's a great way of putting it. I love the way he's like, do they mean the same thing BC as they do AD? Do they mean exactly the same thing?
Yeah.
And in answer to that question, I'm going to start out with a little bit of background so people understand the 10 Commandments, and specifically what the Bible refers to as covenants, because the 10 Commandments are part of what's known as the Sinaitic Covenant. All right. So in order to kind of answer the question of the role maybe that the 10 Commandments play for us as Christians today, I think you need to have a basic understanding of the role of covenants and what they've played in God's story of redemption here throughout the Bible. Most Christians out there probably have heard the word covenant before. If you haven't, you probably heard testament, Old Testament, New Testament. Yeah. A covenant, the best parallel, I guess, to something you might be familiar with would be like a contract. It's a little more personal than a contract is.
Yeah.
But think of it kind of along those lines. It's kind of an arrangement, a deal, an understanding that is struck between God and someone else. At least the covenants we're talking about in the Bible were between God and someone else. You've got the Noahidic covenant. There was a covenant after God flooded the earth. What did he tell Noah? Never going to do this again, right?
Yep.
And he kind of worked out this covenant with Noah not to flood the whole earth again. He gave the sign of the rainbow, all of that. There's the Abrahamic covenant, all right? The covenant that God struck with Abraham. I will bless you, make you a father of many nations, all of this. And so those are some of the covenants that are maybe not as well known in the Bible, but the one we're talking about is the Sinaitic covenant. Sinaitic meaning Sinai, from Mount Sinai, all right? And it was the covenant that God struck with the Jewish people on Mount Sinai. You know, Moses went on Mount Sinai and got the 10 Commandments, came back down, or if you believe, Monty Python, he got the 15 Commandments and then saw them worshiping the golden calf and dropped one of the tablets. But this is the covenant by which he was making the Jewish people into a nation of his chosen nation, which had a purpose behind it. Of course, we see when we look back on it, especially through the eyes of the new covenant, which is, Jesus, that now we kind of see where even more clearly where the old covenant was leading. But as part of that old covenant, God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, all right? And he said, here's these 10 rules that you as a nation are going to have to follow, all right? And then from that, you get the book of like Leviticus, for example, where you take these 10 basic rules and now we need to apply them. We need to figure out, okay, how do we translate these into the more specific situations that the Jewish people are going to be living in every single day? And so the basic general rules of the 10 Commandments got expanded through the Levitical law into these daily activities, how you run your life, the whole sacrificial system. Forgive me, my clip came off of my collar back here, and so I think I sat on my earpiece, and I'm trying to get it back into position, but I can't find the paper clip, so we'll see what happens. If you see me keep adjusting my earpiece, that's why. And so that's kind of what the 10 Commandments originally, the purpose was. It was part of this covenant that God gave to his people. It did get expanded into more specific rules, both some that were revealed, by God through Moses, as far as the inner workings of the sacrificial system, and some that got expanded by the priests over time, which, Jesus had some things to say about that when he came around, about it becoming so heavy of a burden, imposing so heavy of a burden upon the people that he did not approve of. So then some people look at that and say, well, if that's what the 10 Commandments were, if they were just part of this covenant that God struck with the Jewish people, but we're not under that covenant anymore, because even at the time of that covenant, God says, hey, but look out, because I'm going to be making a new one. There's going to be a new covenant coming. And that's what we as Christians now live under, the new covenant, where we put our faith in Jesus Christ as our high priest, as our atoning sacrifice, all of that. Well, then are we still subject to the 10 Commandments? Because those are part of a different covenant. I mean, if you think about it in this sense, you are not expected to do everything that God told Noah to do under the Noahidic covenant. Why? Because you're not part of the Noahidic covenant, all right? You're not expected to do what he's told Abraham to do under the Abrahamic covenant. Why? You're not part of the Abrahamic covenant. So then if you're not part of the Sinaitic covenant, are you subject to these provisions of the Sinaitic covenant, and the ones we're specifically talking about here being the 10 Commandments? Well, where do you think we look to get an answer to this? Well, I suggest Jesus would be a good one to look for.
Yeah,
just
sounds like a good place to start.
Throwing this out there.
Yeah,
all right?
yeah.
And so when we do look at the New Testament, first of all, look at Matthew chapter 19. And this is starting in verse 16. A man comes up to Jesus and he asks, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to get eternal life?" This story probably sounds familiar to a lot of you. And Jesus replies, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There's only one who is good. If you want to enter life, keep the commandments." All right. So we had Jesus at the beginning of this story telling this man who's asking him, "How do I inherit eternal life?" Jesus is specifically citing the 10 Commandments. And he's saying, keep the commandments. And the story goes on where the man asks him which one. Jesus lists a bunch off. He says, "Well, I've kept all these." Mm-hmm. No, you haven't. But okay. He says, anyway, "I've kept all these." And then Jesus says, well, because Jesus, sees right through this guy. "Well, if you really want to be perfect, then, hey, go sell everything off you got and come follow me." Was Jesus telling us all we should sell all of our possessions to follow him? No. Jesus was speaking to this particular man because he knew what was going on in this particular man's heart. But what we see here is Jesus himself is telling someone that they should still be following the commandments. Now, one possible objection to that is that, okay, Ken, but that was before he died on the cross. So the new covenant had not been fully implemented yet at that time. Jesus was talking to a Jewish man who was still under the old covenant. So once he died on the cross and rose, did that change? And would Jesus give a different answer today than post-cross than he did pre-cross? Well, good thing we have some inspired books from post-cross as well. And you can look at I skipped one here. Hold on. The book of Romans, all right, written by Paul to the church in Rome, chapter 13, when he's talking about the role of love versus the law. And in starting in verse 8, this is what Paul says. He says, "Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law." Wait for it, here it comes. "The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law." So here again, post-resurrection, we see the inspired word of God through Paul teaching the church of Rome, where he's still citing the commandments. He's still referring to them and saying, yeah, you should still be doing this stuff. Why? Because you're supposed to love each other. And that's what all these commandments he's citing anyway. That's what these are all about. These are all about love. So we still have Paul saying, yes, we should follow the commandments. Now, all of that, if you just look at that in isolation, you may think, oh, okay, so I guess we're supposed to still, but the commandments mean the same thing, like you said, BA. They still mean the same thing AD as they do BC. Well, as Lee Corso would like to say, not so fast, my friends. Anybody get the sports reference? I don't know if anybody gets it. I don't even know Lee Corso's even on College Game Day anymore. One of my favorite announcers. But anyway.
They have games in college? I'm kidding.
Take a look. I'm going to read it for you here. Matthew chapter 12. All right. What's happening in Matthew chapter 12, right at the beginning of the chapter, is, it's on the Sabbath. All right. And Jesus' disciples are walking through the grain fields, and they start to pick some heads of grain, and they eat them. All right. Now, remember what I told you before is that we started with the 10 Commandments, then expanded with the Levitical law that was revealed to Moses, and then the priests started adding all these other new regulations. Well, remember, one of those commandments is to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Mm-hmm. Well, what we saw happen over the years after that commandment was given was the interpretation of how to keep the Sabbath holy expanded to the point where it's like, you can sit around and lay around like a vegetable on the Sabbath, and that's about all you're allowed to do. Yep. And so some people saw the disciples picking the grain and said, oh, they're working. That's work. It takes work to pick that grain so that they can eat it. And so they are working on the Sabbath. Jesus, your own disciples are not following the commandments, is the accusation that was being made. And then immediately after that, Jesus goes to the synagogue and he sees a man with a shriveled hand. And the same kind of overly legalistic interpretation had come about that said even for someone to do a healing to help someone else on the Sabbath was work. And so they see what Jesus is thinking, and and Jesus actually heals this man's hand on the Sabbath. And so he gets kind of accused of, doing work on the Sabbath in contradiction of the Ten Commandments, specifically the commandment about keeping the Sabbath holy. Well, he calls them out. And here's what Jesus says when all this is going on. He talks to people, his accusers, basically. And he says, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person, the person he was healing, than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And so what we see here is Jesus is kind of laying out some boundaries for us, or a deeper understanding for us of the role of the Ten Commandments. And he's saying, yes, these are rules, these established principles that we're supposed to be following, all right? That does not necessarily mean, though, that we have to be so overly strict about it that we are just, absolutely no work, no work, no work, no work. There is, like Paul was saying in Romans, there's this more overarching message that we're supposed to be getting out of it. And Paul was saying all these commandments were meant to be showing love. And Jesus is saying even these commandments that are about honoring the Sabbath and everything are about honoring God. Well, are you honoring God by healing someone who's sick? Sure you are. So you're still honoring the Sabbath. You're still honoring the commandments, all right? So what do we take away from all of that? So we have these commandments that were given under this old covenant that we say we're not part of anymore, all right? And yet we see Jesus and Paul both telling us in some way, shape, or form that those commandments should still be followed. Then we also see Jesus saying, yeah, but not so strictly that you're losing the sight of the forest through the trees, essentially. And so when we put all this together, what we get is this. The old covenant had a number of, ceremonial laws, for example, procedural laws, sacrificial laws, all right, where, for example, we don't anymore go about and sacrifice animals. Why? Because that part of the law and that purpose of the law has been perfectly fulfilled by Jesus Christ in his sacrifice. Want more on that? Come to the Hebrews Bible study. That's going to be starting tonight here at Trinity. I will be teaching at 6:30 on Wednesday nights for this fall, because we're going to be talking a lot about that as we walk through the book of Hebrews. So there are certain parts of the law. It's not that they've been invalidated. It's not that they've been erased. They've just been fulfilled. You don't need to do this anymore because the new covenant fulfilled those purposes in a far better way than the old covenant ever did, all right? But there are also certain universal principles. Remember one thing about God. God does not change, all right? He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, which means if God says you shouldn't murder, that he hates murder, guess what? If he hated murder back when he gave the Sinaitic covenant, he still hates murder today. Now, as he expanded the Sinaitic covenant through the Levitical law, certainly to his Jewish people, he laid down certain rules, certain penalties, and a way to handle murder when they found it in their ranks, all right? That part of the law was unique to the Sinaitic covenant. So we may not necessarily be required to address things in the same way that they were required to address them under that old covenant. Why? Because we're not part of that old covenant. But the universal rule that God hates murder, that's part of his character. That's part of who he is. And so that still holds true even today. Just because we don't have to, stone a person caught in adultery anymore doesn't mean that God all of a sudden approves of adultery, all right? He still disapproves of that action. That action is still morally wrong. It's just that now it's being handled through the new covenant and the forgiveness and the grace of Jesus Christ, rather than the old covenant and the system they had there. So Do the Ten Commandments still apply today? Yes, because they illustrate things about God. They tell us what God approves of, what God doesn't approve of, and also the respect and honor and worship that God himself deserves. All right? Do the specific penalties and the procedures that grew out of the Ten Commandments and were part and parcel of the Jewish community before Jesus, are those still applicable for us today? No, those are not. But that doesn't relieve you of the moral obligation under the Ten Commandments themselves and what they actually said. So does it apply exactly the same way, BC as AD? I would say the general principles that underlie the Ten Commandments, the answer to that is yes. The laws that grew out of them, we have to look at them on a case-by-case basis, but arguably, most likely, no.
Okay.
So does that answer that question?
That answers my question, but I think some people online, not so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to bring up one specific thing that someone mentioned, and I will tackle it?
I already do have a favorite, but I'm going to wait 10 minutes to talk about it.
Okay.
Let's see. Actually, I think this one looks pretty good, although it is a little bit long. I'm going to start on page 2. That is difficult to say. Many Jewish people in our modern-day world will emphatically state that the enslavement of their ancestors never occurred. That's the one. There's a lot here. Actually, hold on. Sorry, that's the one I want to talk about in 10 minutes because I talk about plagiarism of the Bible in the Bible. So I didn't read that. Here we go. This one I think is pretty easy to answer. Are the Ten Commandments binding today? Their answer is no. The people who carry those commandments have been killing people and stealing land. Over 1 billion of them have been creating images for thousands of years and bowing down to them. Billions more don't recognize the Sabbath but created their own rest day, and today's economy is based on covetousness. By Captain Noahide.
Noahide, who I think we've read some of Captain Noahide's comments on the air before, if I remember correctly. The tag, or what's the word I'm looking for? The handle or whatever looks familiar to me. I don't want to misinterpret what Captain Noahide is saying. I remember when I first read this comment, I had one reaction to it. And then as you're reading it to me just now, BA, I had, wait a minute, maybe there's another way of looking at this. All right. We asked the question of, are the Ten Commandments binding today? Thinking, and I think the interpretation, what we were going for was, are they still something that we should be following?
Yeah.
As I read this comment, part of me wonders if the way Captain Noahide took it was more like, do we still see people living them out today? Are people still, as a practical matter, are they still following them today? And the answer that they're giving here is no, because, the people who are supposed to be following them aren't following them.
Yeah.
And, if that is what Captain Noahide was trying to say, I mean, obviously, to a large extent, I would agree with that because we're all sinners. We all mess up. I would only say that that's nothing new. What were the Jewish people doing when Moses came down from Sinai with these commandments? Yeah. They built a golden calf. I mean, and they already knew they weren't supposed to be doing that.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, to the extent you're saying that people are, building idols, so over 1 billion of them had been creating images for thousands of years. Yeah, that was happening even back then. And we look through the history of the Jewish people. I mean, you read, the Old Testament, what do you see a picture of? You see an entire picture of God saying to the Jewish people, hey, I love you, you're my people, do this. Jewish people saying, yes, 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 we're going to do it. And then time goes on, they drift away. Mm-hmm. And God says, okay, but you understand, here's the penalty you face for drifting away. Penalty gets imposed. Jewish people come back and say, we're sorry, we're going to do it this time. Mm-hmm. And then, rinse, repeat over and over again, just keeps going through that. So if that's what Captain Noahide was trying to say and trying to get at, then that's nothing new. I mean, that's what we've seen throughout history. And I don't mean to sound like I'm calling out the Jewish people in particular. I got news for you. That's what we Christians do too. How many Christians out there do you see that think of God as like a cosmic vending machine that only come to him when they want something in return and aren't necessarily living their lives day to day in a way that is God honoring? How many people only, this is going to hit some people hard, but I'm going to say it. How many people out there only come to church when it's convenient? If you've got, oh, I can't come to church for the next 3 months because of my kid's sports team. Well, what's that say to God? How do you think God takes that? I mean, that tells God that you think that sports are more important than worshiping him. And so that's the kind of thing where it's certainly not something that's unique to the Jewish people. It's something that we Christians are just as guilty of, I think, of kind of of being hypocrites, of not following through with what we're supposed to be doing. Pastor Jay had a great line in a sermon a few months ago, actually probably a year ago now. He said, "Are Christians a bunch of hypocrites?" Yes, and there's room for one more, so come on and join us. We're all hypocrites. What we're supposed to be doing is trying not to be, trying to do better, and praying sincerely to God to send the Holy Spirit into our heart to help us along that journey. So, you got another one you want me to answer?
Let's see. Okay. I think this. Actually, no. This guy pretty much. The echo's getting me again. This guy pretty much agrees with you. Binding on whom? On Jews, yes. On non-Jews, no. But many of them are also contained in the Noahide laws. So somewhat the guy with the balloon, page 1.
Yeah, and that's and that get also I was thinking of the very top comment as well that reminded me, the guy that said from a Christian perspective, I would argue that all 10 of these commandments fall under Jesus' commandments, even if we aren't specifically bound to the original listing anymore. The same kind of thing. It's like, well, we're not, non-Jews who aren't part of that Sinaitic covenant aren't bound specifically by the Sinaitic covenant. Yeah. But that doesn't mean we're not still bound by these same principles that define who God is, because God is the same today as he was when he gave that Sinaitic covenant. So if he hated something back then, he's still going to hate it now. And if we claim to love God and to be servants of God, that's a word that doesn't get not too popular, I think, today, especially in America, where we do live in a free country. We're blessed to live in a free country. But I think sometimes we get to the point where we forget that our primary loyalty is supposed to be to God. And while God does free us from sin, we are supposed to be servants of God. There is an authority that we are supposed to be subjecting ourselves to. And if we are doing that, then these principles that we see illustrated in the 10 Commandments should still be binding on us today. Yeah.
So, and there's something I'm struck by. I don't remember where I've heard it from. I'm pretty sure it's from fiction. Wow. Now that I really think about it, I'm pretty sure it's a quote from a Batman comic.
Well, then I might know it. Okay, let's go for it. Let's go, man.
Alfred Pennyworth. I am not Master Wayne's slave. I am his servant. It's by choice. And then we're mixing mediums here. But
anytime you can work Batman in anything, I'm cool with that.
Okay.
That is awesome. He's the best superhero ever. Don't tell me he's not a superhero. I will fight you. Verbally,
Just not like him. But it's better to be a servant to God than a slave to sin. So that one's on me.
I currently have 2 Batman toys sitting on my desk behind BA as
he
we
does.
Speak. I don't think you can see him in the camera. Can you see him in the camera?
I think. No, it's just off screen. No, there it is, right there. That guy right there. You see him.
So I've got more at home, including my original Adam West toy and everything. I don't bring that one in, still in the package. Anyway, so yeah, I mean that it's something that we are subjecting ourselves to. Now, it gets a little confusing when you start talking about, that's a whole other class we can go into about, what the Bible means by slavery versus what we've come to understand to mean today. Because sometimes you do see the Bible talk about how the fact we are supposed to be God's slaves. Sometimes some translations will use that term, but it's still something that, it's more like a king. And we don't have a king in our country today. So this is kind of a foreign concept to us, where he is our ruler that we are subject to. Now, technically speaking, we're subject to him whether we acknowledge it or not. God still reigns over all creation. Yeah. All right. He's still in charge. He just allows us the freedom to rebel if that's what we do, because he respects our free will. And that's a whole other conversation we'll get into, but not today. So why don't we go into the one you wanted me to talk about? Because it is 335 and it's related, but also takes us down a somewhat unrelated path. So
let's see. There we go. Okay. So this is a long boy from Campbell Hayden. That is difficult to say. Many of the Jewish people in our modern day world will emphatically state that the enslavement of their ancestors never occurred. They will rightfully point out that the only place where the persecution of the Jews occurs, along with a God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, is in the Bible. It appears that though the biblical authors rather intentionally plagiarized 7 Noahide laws, modified them, and then collusively turned them into the 10 Commandments, all for the sake of what would later turn into Christ-based faiths, this would have been This, of course, would have then given them the broad opportunity to add, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, along with keeping the Sabbath holy, honoring one's parents, which is not a commandment from God, because it was an expectation in Jewish culture. Consequently, oh my goodness, and with this in mind, I didn't realize how long it was. I just got
It's very long, yes.
Plagiarism. I'm going to put a bracket, ellipses bracket at the end of this.
I think we got the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just really, I feel like there's something really important about knowing what the Noahide laws are and when they occurred and whether or not one can plagiarize one's self, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, here's the gist of what this commenter is claiming. All right. Basically claiming that a lot of what modern Jews claim to be history, first of all, they say is not. They try to say that, well, there's really no evidence that the Jews were ever actually, their ancestors were ever really oppressed. The Bible's the only place that's mentioned. I think there's actually a good amount of evidence for that. We don't have time to go into all the archaeological evidence and everything for that. For the Exodus, I think there is a good amount of evidence for the Exodus out of Egypt, for example. But then the second paragraph there that you're really getting at, they say, the next accusation they make is it appears as though the biblical authors rather intentionally plagiarized the 7 Noahide laws, modified them, and then collusively turned them into the 10 Commandments, all for the sake of what would later turn into Christ-based faiths. So I guess they're trying to claim that the Jewish authorities at some point took these 7 Noahide laws and the Bible supposedly had not been written down yet, and so then they said, hey, we're going to pretend, probably as most people would say as a means of controlling others, we're going to pretend that these 10 Commandments thing happened back on Mount Sinai. And so we're going to write a book that essentially takes these 7 Noahide laws, turns them into commandments that God supposedly gave on Mount Sinai, and add a few things in there that we think are really important, that are more cultural, that aren't necessarily included in the 7 Noahide laws. And when I read this, my first reaction is, a lot of people, they'll say things like, well, you could say that the 10 Commandments actually came out of the 7 Noahide laws. And I said, that's right. You can say just about anything you want, but that doesn't make it a reasonable thing to say. So first of all, the question is, what are the 7 Noahide laws? Because that may be something that doesn't sound familiar to a lot of people. This is something, I admit I'm not an expert, so I ask for grace if I get any of the details wrong, but here is at least my understanding of what the topic is that we're talking about. There is what was originally supposedly an oral tradition in the Jewish faith that was eventually recorded in the Jewish Talmud that to Adam and Eve, that God gave some general principles, 7 general principles to Noah. I said Adam and Eve, to Noah. All right. And so before Noah, for those you don't know, Noah is earlier in time than Moses. Okay. So before the Sinaitic covenant ever happened, God gave these 7 rules to Noah. Great flood. These are the rules that are supposed to govern everybody who is walking the earth after the great flood. All right. And the idea being that after this, God then gives the 10 Commandments, but those are specifically to the Jewish people, not to everyone. And so the idea is that Jewish people, from the time of Sinai on, Jewish people are subject to the 10 Commandments. But anyone who's not Jewish can still have, however you define salvation under this faith system, based upon following the 7 Noahide laws. So the Noahide laws were for everyone. The 10 Commandments were just a subset of everyone, meaning the Jewish people. And what were those 7 Noahide laws? They were, don't worship idols, don't curse God, don't commit murder, don't commit adultery or sexual immorality, don't steal, don't eat flesh torn from a living animal, so kill it first, and that to establish courts of justice. These were what the 7 Noahide laws supposedly were. Now, what's important to remember is these 7 Noahide laws were allegedly passed on orally, and only orally, until they were finally written down. And when were they finally written down? Well, the first appearance of them, and again, I'm going to apologize if I'm mispronouncing things, it was in what's called the Tosefta, all right? The Tosefta was an addendum, all right, to the Mishnah. What is the Mishnah? The Mishnah is a collection of oral sayings that were then recorded and written down, okay? And some of the sayings, I guess, weren't in there. And so the Tosefta was written to kind of act as an addendum to the Mishnah to write down additional sayings. So the Tosefta is the first time we see these 7 Noahide laws actually in written form, that we can actually verify, yes, they actually exist. When was the Tosefta written? Well, supposedly late 2nd century AD. All right. Now, that is not to say that we have a copy of the Tosefta from the 2nd century. We don't. All right. The earliest copy we have of the Tosefta is actually from the 12th century. So 1,000 years after it was supposedly written is the earliest copy we have. Now, I don't want to make that sound disparaging at all in that, because that is actually that kind of gap between when a document is written and when we have our earliest copy is actually not uncommon at all in antiquity, all right? So 1,000 years is really not all that uncommon. You look at things like Homer's Iliad, things like that, you're going to see similar things. But it is still 1,000 years before we actually have a physical copy of it. But even if we assume, for the sake of argument, that dating is correct, that it was written down in the late 2nd century, the question then becomes, well, what happens if we compare the 10 Commandments and ask those same questions of the 10 Commandments? Well, the 10 Commandments were written in the book of Exodus, all right? Exodus chapter 20. When you date the original writing of Exodus is going to depend on what scholar you talk to. You know, obviously, if you think like the traditional viewpoint that the book of Exodus was written by Moses, well, that puts it really, really far back. That puts it at the time of Moses, okay? But more importantly, let's ask that second question. When is our earliest copy that we physically have a copy of, that we have our hands on, of the book of Exodus? And that comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls, all right? The Dead Sea Scrolls, we have physical copies of the book of Exodus from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest of which, I want to make sure I'm right here before I say it, so I'm not speaking out of turn, was from approximately, let's see, sometime in the 1st century BC, maybe earlier. I'm being conservative here because there were copies of Exodus that were dated back to 250 BC, all right? Okay. But I can't say definitively off the top of my head, because not all these were complete books. You know, they were fragments of Exodus, because let's face it, you know, things get eaten away over time. And so you find something, it's not necessarily going to have every single word. Some of the pages are going to be more intact than others. And so I don't want to speak out of turn and say definitively we have a copy of the actual 10 Commandments from 250 BCE. We do still have definitely have a copy of 10 Commandments from at least sometime around, 100 years or so before Christ was born, possibly up to 250 years before Christ was born. So right off the bat, you see that if we just look at the documentary evidence that we have, all right, we have physical copies of the book of Exodus and of the 10 Commandments hundreds of years before the Tosefta was allegedly even written, and over 1,000 years before we even have a copy of the Tosefta. And so it's hard to argue convincingly that there's any evidence whatsoever, aside from wishful thinking, that the 10 Commandments were somehow plagiarized from the 7 Noahide laws, when we know for a fact that we have physical copies of the Ten Commandments that are hundreds of years older than the Tosefta, which is the first written record of the seven Noahide laws, before it was even allegedly written. All right? And so that's where we get to the point where evidence matters, unfortunately. So you can say certainly anything you want. And someone can certainly say, well, I think that the Ten Commandments were plagiarized from the seven Noahide laws. But if you say that, then my next question is going to be, okay, well, what evidence do you have for that? I'm not saying that the seven Noahide laws were not orally passed down from the time of Noah. I'm not denying that part of Jewish tradition. They certainly could have been, all right? But the fact that mere fact alone, and the fact that there's some similarity between the laws that God laid down in the seven Noahide laws and the laws he gave the Jewish people in the Ten Commandments, does not mean that there was some vast conspiracy in the Jewish authorities to make up the Ten Commandments and plagiarize the seven Noahide laws. Why is there similarity between those two laws? Because they were both given by the same God, who has the same moral principles that he wants to follow. Yeah. The fact is there's no evidence of such plagiarism, and unfortunately, evidence does matter, if you want to make a claim.
Yeah.
All right. Did I answer that one?
I'm pretty sure you did. That's right. For me.
All right. Well, it is 3:46, so I'm gonna wrap things up here a little bit.
Sounds good.
So I do appreciate everybody that submitted their questions and their comments. This was and I want to thank BA especially for kind of getting the ball rolling with this topic today. I think it's one that a lot of people have questions about, not just specifically for the Ten Commandments, but also for the Levitical laws and everything that kind of grew out of those Ten Commandments. So hopefully we were able to give you some answers for that today. I do appreciate any ongoing prayers. I do probably have a relatively longer journey. Some people recover from Bell's palsy in a couple of weeks. Obviously, I am not one of those people, but I have had a lot of progress, and I'm very grateful for the prayers and for all that God has done to bring me as far as he has. I just want to keep it going. Keep it going. So just a reminder, hey, if you did like this video, go ahead and click the like button on there. Subscribe to the YouTube channel so you don't miss any of our great content, including that upcoming show, the 513 show that I told you about at the beginning of our program. Click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any notifications when we do post new content. And get your comment here on a future show by going to trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. That's where you can submit your question or comment about what you want us to talk about, because this entire show is driven by you, our viewer. Also, again, comment on Reddit. Every Monday we post a question or a prompt on Reddit. Our subreddit is Talk About God. You can go there and you can comment there as well to get your thoughts on here. And obviously, if you're not watching us live, put your comments down there in the comments section. Not only does that help us, because the way YouTube works gets more people to be able to see it, but we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you have to say and what your thoughts are here on the Ten Commandments. Do you think they're still binding? Is there anything I said today that you agree with, disagree with, have more questions about? We'd love to hear from you. So that being said, hopefully, God willing, we will be on the air again next Wednesday at 3 o'clock, and we'll actually be able to keep that and make that happen this time. Thank you, BA, for everything that you've done today.
No problem at all.
And thank you all for watching. We will see you next week. God bless.